Today we get to celebrate the completion of Matthew's fourth section, or my attempt to teach through that fourth section of Matthew. And as usual, before we leave a section behind, I want to do a final message on it to summarize and conclude everything, to hopefully take all of these things I've been talking about and bind them together into something a little more concrete for you, so that when we move on, it's not all totally forgotten. And so for my outline today, I want to do three things as part of summarizing and concluding all of this. First thing I want to do is just survey the fourth section of Matthew very quickly from the standpoint of Matthew's outline. And this will be the briefest point, but just to very summarily remind you of what the fourth section is in terms of maybe drawing lines in your Bible in the margins or whatever, if any of you do that. Second, I want to examine the fourth section with regard to the disciples, who are one half of this equation that this trajectory I've been giving you. Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. So the second point here is to focus on the disciples side of that. And then finally, I want to examine the fourth section of Matthew with regard to the enemies of Christ. So they're the last half of that summary statement I've always given you about the opposition becoming more stubborn. As we go through this, I want to focus your mind on one thought that has preoccupied me probably more than other thoughts throughout this entire fourth section. Is this something that's been coming back to my mind quite a bit as you contemplate these two groups of people that Matthew is really covering. And the thought is that faith leads to understanding, which leads to greater faith, while unbelief leads to foolishness, which leads to even less faith. So both sides of the story here very much on their own pathways, going in different directions. And I decided to call this the spiral of faith and understanding, which is also my title for this message. And also, if you want to give kind of a secondary note or a secondary title to this fourth section, it'd be that, the spiral of faith and understanding. So you have people like the disciples who approach Jesus from the attitude of faith. They enter into this Jesus thing with, in the very least, an open mind and an eagerness to believe in Christ. And it's little faith, but it is faith. You don't necessarily want to denigrate the smallness of their faith too much, because it is, after all, faith. And because the disciples started with faith, they grow to understand Jesus better. Throughout the course of these 4 chapters, they actually learn. They actually know more. And the end result of all of that is a greater increase of that original faith. It has actually been cultivated into something greater than what it was before. And so for the disciples, the spiral of faith and understanding goes upward. They start with faith, they kind of go around to more understanding, around to greater faith, and presumably that'll keep going to more understanding, greater faith, more understanding, greater faith still. It's a spiral upward. And that spiral continues to go for the rest of their life, really, as they grow in faith and understanding. Meanwhile, the enemies of Christ approach Jesus from the attitude of unbelief, the exact opposite attitude, a very closed-minded attitude, not willing at all, or not willing at all to take Jesus for what he is, or to fully embrace this life of a disciple. And because they started with unbelief, their understanding of Christ actually diminishes. They actually lose ground in that regard. And the end result of it is an even harder, more faithless heart than before. As they understand less, they actually believe less and less, which is impressive because they didn't have much faith at all to begin with. So for the enemies of Christ, the spiral goes downward. You start with unbelief, that kind of leads you down to less understanding of who Jesus is, going down to even less faith in him, down to even understanding less, and on it goes downward. And they continue on that path for the rest of their lives. So really these verses that we discover toward the beginning of this fourth section in Matthew 13 summarize it pretty well. Matthew 13 verses 10 through 12. The disciples came and said to Jesus, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And Jesus answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away." And that's the idea. That's exactly what I'm talking about with this spiral of faith and understanding. While the disciples believe the signs, and while the opposition becomes more stubborn, they're both riding the same spiral. It's all one thing. The only difference is they're riding it in different directions. The disciples are riding it upward through greater levels of faith and understanding, and everyone else is riding it downward to lower and lower levels of faith and understanding. And that is generally what I want you to get out of this fourth section. And that's going to be the main flavor of this whole summary message here. So to really get moving with my first point, before we get into the details of that whole spiral that I've laid out for you, I want to survey the fourth section from the standpoint of Matthew's outline. Very much, once again, coming back to these details of outlining that I always come to as I try to lay out this book for you. Now this section, this fourth section, is, as I have laid it out, from chapter 12, verse 38, through chapter 16, verse 20. Roughly 4 chapters, kind of staggered, between the beginning and ending of those chapters initially. Now, as with most of Matthew's sections, there is some overlap at the beginning and the end with sections 3 and 5. There is very much these places where sections 3 and 4 are kind of, they're not like a hard break, they kind of phase one into the other. And then same thing as we go from 4 into 5, they kind of phase one into the other. Matthew does not seem to like strong breaks, but rather transitions. He kind of ekes you from one kind of topic into another, and that's how he handles these breaks in his outlines. But we know the general boundaries of this fourth section because it has some similar stories toward the beginning and the end. And I pointed these out to you at the first and throughout this, these bookends, as you might think of them. The first is Matthew 12, verses 38 and 39, where we see this incident. Then some of the scribes and the Pharisees answered Jesus, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." And then you go to toward the ending of this fourth section, and you have a very similar story, chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And he answered, "When it is evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." So those stories are very similar. You have hostile groups asking Jesus for a sign. He rebuffs them as an evil and adulterous generation and tells them they're not going to get any sign but the sign of the prophet Jonah. Very similar stories. They form what I've called an inclusio, which basically is a way of giving similar sounding phrases or statements or stories at the beginning and ending of a section in order to block it off as a section. They're like bookends. Now this fourth section does go a little bit further into chapter 16. The second of those two boundary markers is chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, but I have carried the fourth section a little bit further, and I've done that for a reason. We need to extend it further because the next story builds on the Pharisees and the Sadducees testing Jesus. You go straight from their request for a sign into this, verse 5. When the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." So clearly we move from that story into this next story. Jesus still has this encounter on his mind with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he just brings that over into this account. And so you have to keep those together because they're linked. But you also have to go a little bit further because of the next story and what it does. Just to read verses 13 through 20. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" Which is a very important question. And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" So an important follow-up question. I mean, you guys, you follow me around all the time. Who do you say that I am? Then Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," which is a very important answer to two very important questions. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven," which is a very important conclusion and implication of everything we've seen so far in these verses and the fourth section eventually, as I talked about last time I spoke. "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on the earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on the earth shall be loosed in heaven." Very important declarations in the midst of all these very important things being said. This story really has to be here at the end of the fourth section because it's such a climax. So many important things come to a head right here that are so connected to what we've been doing over the past 4 chapters, you have to go a little bit further into here. So that's why in my breakdown of the fourth section, I extend it this far. You go from about 12:38, where you see the first of those stories asking Jesus for a sign, through to about this point in chapter 16, and that gets you this fourth section of Matthew's Gospel as I have outlined it. Now, to remind you of maybe the major divisions within that fourth section, I have treated it as having 2 halves, 2 major divisions here that Matthew does. The first half I called the parables of the kingdom for the disciples of the kingdom, and then the second half was stories of disciples and doubters. So you have 2 very noticeable halves of this fourth section of Matthew where he does 2 very different things. In the first half, Jesus was telling stories about the kingdom. In the second half, Matthew tells stories about Jesus. So they are in a sense story-based, but the first half is Jesus telling you these parables through which the disciples of the kingdom are going to learn things. And he actually characterizes what disciples of the kingdom are like. The second half, Matthew kind of steps back and tells you stories about Jesus in which he deals variously with people who are disciples, who believe in Christ, or those who are in some way doubtful and are not really on board with what Jesus is doing. That said, both halves still contain the 2 common themes, that Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition grows more stubborn. And both are still very much related to this spiral of faith and understanding that I have in mind as I talk about this fourth section. Now, the last thing to say from an outlining standpoint is that Matthew uses this section to further his goal. Of course, I make a big deal about that Matthew didn't just start writing stuff down. It wasn't just sort of the thing to do, nothing better to do at this time in life. No, he actually has a purpose, and actually a 2-fold purpose for writing this gospel, and that is to evangelize and disciple the Jews of Israel. He wants to take his own people, they're in that land, and he wants to convince them to be Christians and then to train them up as Christians through what he writes. Matthew's gospel seems to target an audience of Jews living in Israel under the traditions and beliefs of Israel. As you read his gospel with that background, it really seems to fit very well, and I, of course, usually try to bring that out as I go passage to passage in this study. Matthew wants those Jews to see Jesus as their long-awaited Messiah. He wants them to realize that all of the hopes of Israel have come to rest on this one man, Jesus. He wants them to believe that, and he also wants to grow them as disciples as they come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. He wants to train them in what it means to break with standard Judaism in its various forms and now follow this man Jesus in all of his radical ideas and all the things he was trying to teach. And to do this, to accomplish both of those goals, Matthew shows you 2 very different trajectories. He shows you 2 kinds of people walking 2 different pathways. The disciples on the one hand, begin with faith. They believe the signs being done by Jesus. You see them at the beginning of this fourth section, very much followers of Jesus already, and they follow him. And in their belief, they are granted greater understanding. You see Jesus teach them. You see them learn things that are not general knowledge, things that he teaches only them, things that only they see. And by the end of the section, you see their faith nourished and grown. You see them a few steps further in terms of their belief than they were beforehand. Meanwhile, the other trajectory, you have the opposition to Jesus. The enemies of Jesus begin with a stubborn refusal to believe what they see. They're just not willing to commit to the obvious truths before them, and by the end of the fourth section, their understanding of Jesus has been stunted. They're actually worse off in terms of their comprehension of who he is. And their unbelief, therefore, sinks to deeper levels as they understand less and less of who Jesus is. Matthew shows you both trajectories in this section, and that's because both paths help to accomplish his purposes. To unbelievers, it's a plea to believe or face the consequences of unbelief, to become like the people that you encounter in this section. And I'll give you a very full summary later on when we get there. Meanwhile, to believers, it's an encouragement to continue in faith, so that they may continue to understand what they have been given and believe yet more. It is an encouragement to disciples from the lives of the first disciples. So you see both here. You see his goal of evangelizing the Jews of Israel, but also discipling them, in seeing both paths as we see them laid out here in this fourth section. So that was my attempt to lay this out from the perspective of Matthew's outline and just how his fourth section works in his outline for his gospel. Now, the second thing I want to do is examine the fourth section with regard to the disciples. We're going to pay more attention to their story as we follow their path from faith to understanding to greater faith, and then hopefully to further understanding to greater faith, and on upward the spiral. And here's my point about the disciples. The disciples of Christ, though weak in faith, slowly grow to understand more, and thus slowly grow in faith. Again, they ride the spiral upward. From the beginning of the fourth section, we know these men are, in some sense, believers. They are the true believers out of all the people in Israel, and that's how we know them. Now, what does their little faith actually get them? That's the question we ask. As they start off here, disciples of Jesus, still very green, so to speak, what does their sort of, their little faith get them in the course of these 4 chapters? Well, let's answer that question. First of all, the disciples are embraced by Jesus as his only family. And we're going to jump back to the beginning, of course, of the fourth section. We're going to walk through it here and just sort of hit the mountaintops of the disciples as they follow Jesus through this fourth section. Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 49. And while Jesus was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, "Who is my mother, and who are my brothers?" And stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." So, that's what we see here. And we often focus on Jesus' attitude toward his family. People are like, "Oh, he's so cold," and I have more to say about that later. Just right now, don't miss the real point of that Jesus adopts his disciples as his family, very much in distinction to his biological family, Mary and his brothers and presumably his sisters as well. This is commitment here. This is rock-solid dedication. Jesus has just extended to these men the closest possible relationship. He has said to these very unimpressive men with their very little faith so far, he has said to them, "You are my mothers, my brothers, my sisters, you are my family." Jesus has gone all in. These guys took baby steps forward as disciples so far, and Jesus just goes all out with it. For their little uninformed faith, the disciples have already received a die-hard, dedicated brother. The disciples are embraced by Jesus as his only family. That is the first thing that their little faith gets them so far. Next, the disciples come to understand the secrets of the kingdom through parables. I don't know why I had trouble saying that word just now. It's not parables, it's parables. Okay. So those parables, of course, make up the bulk of chapter 13. We spent a lot of time plowing through those and really hitting them very hard. They make up the first half of the fourth section, the parables of the kingdom for disciples of the kingdom. And I've already quoted Jesus' reason for teaching in parables. That reason being to hide truth from the unbelievers, but reveal it to the disciples. So a twofold purpose: to actually shut some people out from the mysteries of the kingdom, while opening the doors of those mysteries to his disciples. And here's how that ends. End of chapter 13, verses 51 through 52. He says to his disciples, "Have you understood all these things?" And they said to him, "Yes." And he said to them, "Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." Now Jesus has to interpret some of those parables for them. They actually come to him and ask him, "Hey, explain this to us." And he does that for them. So he does have to explain these things with some detail. And I'm also sure that even at the end when they say, yes, they understand, they don't understand these things quite as well as they could have. Certainly not as well as they did later, and possibly not even as well as we do now. But Jesus does accept their answer. They say yes, and he very much moves on as though he accepts that. He even tells them he's going to make them into the new scribes of the kingdom. They're going to be the expert scholars of the kingdom of heaven. So he very much accepts them as saying, yes, we understand these things. So even now, that little faith that they had at the beginning is serving as a foundation for this slow growth in their understanding. They are beginning to crawl slowly upward, that spiral of faith and understanding I was talking about. The disciples come to understand the secrets of the kingdom of heaven through parables. Now, the next thing they understand is this. They come to understand the identity of Jesus through the sea miracle. That is the incident where Jesus walks on the water. Through that, they come to understand who Jesus is. This is, of course, where Jesus does his miracle walking on the water. I just want to read the end of that account. It's Matthew 14, verses 28 through 33. So Jesus is already walking on the water at this point. And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now, I think this confession of Jesus as the Son of God is perhaps worth less than the later confession by Peter. They're, of course, very similar, and you can compare them. Both feature disciples confessing Jesus to be the Son of God. But I think this story here is maybe of a little bit less value simply because it's such a moment of high emotion. I mean, you're out there, you're on this storm, you think you're going to die. Here comes Jesus walking on water. Yeah, it's as though it were ground, but he's going to walk on the water to you. Peter jumps out there, starts walking on water, then starts to sink. Jesus has to rescue him. Then immediately the storm stops. You just got all kinds of stuff pumping through you. Moment of high emotion. They say, "Truly you are the Son of God." So I don't think it's quite as, an intellectual commitment as the later statement is going to be by Peter. That said, you see when they say this, the right idea has started to dawn in their mind. The right idea, he is the Son of God. He is that. And that idea has come to their mind, It has come to the forefront of their mind to the point where they are willing to say it. They have very much moved forward into understanding the identity of Christ. Now notice they are still men of little faith. Peter, the one who had enough faith to jump out there and start walking on the water with Jesus, is still rebuked as a man of little faith in the story. So even right now, they are still men of little faith. And yet through that small amount of faith, Jesus has revealed to these men what so few people understood at that time, his identity as the Son of God. They have come to see that. They have moved forward in their understanding of Christ through their little faith. Then, the next thing here, the disciples come to understand the mission of Jesus through his dealings with Gentiles. They have come to understand a little bit more of what Jesus has come here to do as the Son of God. Now, in chapter 15, we see Jesus heal the daughter of the Canaanite woman. Remember, this is the woman whose daughter is cruelly oppressed by a demon and comes to Jesus seeking for help. At first looks like she's not going to get it, but then does. She overwhelms him with her great faith. And then after that, we see Jesus feed the 4,000, which is a crowd of people that I argued was largely Gentile. So you see Jesus going from ministering to one Gentile to ministering to a whole crowd of Gentiles. Now, those would have been big moments to the disciples who would have finally come to see that God's mercy was not only for Jews, but also for the nations. And I spent quite a bit of time in those stories showing you how those ideas were brought forth and the implication of those ideas. And really, with the story of the woman in particular, it's the beginning of the long-awaited, long-predicted showing of God's mercy to nations other than Israel. So it was a big moment for the disciples. And that knowledge would have put the disciples miles ahead of the smartest rabbi in Israel. I mean, you go to any of the rabbis teaching in the synagogues in Israel, there's not a lot of love for Gentiles there, not a lot of appreciation for what God is going to do. The extent of their knowledge is probably that the Messiah someday will take a rod of iron and bash them all to pieces. You know, probably these kinds of passages they prefer to talk about when living under heavy Roman oppression. But the disciples have now come to see that, hey, the Son of God, the Christ, actually has good plans for the nations and for Gentiles. So the disciples come to understand the mission of Jesus through dealings with Gentiles. And again, this is still just through their little faith at this point. Not really great faith by any means. Now on that note, talking about this faith and understanding they have, the disciples still struggle to understand, but even in struggling, they still grow in understanding. They struggle at this, but they do in fact grow. And you're coming close to the end, Matthew 16, verses 5 through 12. I'll finish this story that I started earlier. He says to them, see here, when the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, "Well, we brought no bread." You know, that's why he's saying that to us. But Jesus, aware of this, said, "O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, in my discussion of the feeding miracles, I urged us to see them as great displays of who Jesus was and what he came to do. They were the great signs of the giving Savior. That was my title, I think, for the feeding of the 5,000. And of course, we revisited all those ideas when we got to the feeding of the 4,000. The disciples saw them firsthand twice, right? I mean, they saw Jesus do this miraculous provision of food, and then they saw him do it again. And yet they still fail to understand the basic idea really very basic compared to all the ideas present in those feeding miracles. They fail to understand the basic idea that Jesus can provide bread, that a lack of food is not a problem for this man. And that kind of low understanding is going to cause a low amount of faith in their future if that continues. Not even realizing that Jesus can provide for your basic needs is going to keep you at a very low level of understanding and faith. I mean, you're going to be very much working with the training wheels on your bike if that's where you're going to stay. So Jesus doesn't want to keep them that way, so he, gives them some prompting, gives them some rebuking, and with a little bit of prompting and a little bit of rebuking, Jesus brings them along to where they finally understand what he's trying to say at this point. Verse 12, it says they finally understood. He's not talking about the leaven of bread. He's talking about bewaring of the false teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I pointed out when I taught on this that this story represents what must have been a daily occurrence with the disciples, where Jesus says something, they don't get it. Jesus has to kind of, fan the flames here, and finally it's like, okay, they get it now. They understand it. The disciples struggle to understand, but they still grow in understanding. They're still moving up the spiral. So where does that leave the disciples now that we've come here so close to the end of this fourth section? Well, the disciples are ready for the next phase of Jesus' ministry. They're ready for what we might call stage 5, I guess. We'll call it that, because we're getting ready to go into the fifth section here. They're ready for the next phase of Jesus' ministry. Now, when I taught on that last passage that I read about the whole bread thing, when I taught on that, I mentioned it was the last time that Jesus rebukes the disciples for their little faith. It's a very common refrain in the first 16 chapters of Matthew, but from here on out, Jesus doesn't say that to them anymore, which implies that they have graduated to the next level. They have gone from little faith to satisfactory faith. They've gone from, making a D on their test to making a C. They've gone to satisfactory levels of faith at least. And you also see that their understanding has solidified. Matthew 16, verses 13 through 16 again. When Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they say, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Unlike the confession made during the sea miracle, this confession is made in a moment of calm, having pondered several other opinions around them. They've had some time to think, since that last miracle where Jesus, walks on the water and calms the storm, and they call him the Son of God. They've had time to think about what they said back then. They've also had time to think about what other people are saying about Jesus being one of these old prophets back from the dead. And they have concluded over this time, and they have stated in a moment of calm, or at least Peter has, that Jesus really is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So at this moment, the disciples have come not only to believe in Jesus a little more strongly, but to understand him a little bit better. They have moved up in their understanding and have graduated to higher levels of faith. And that makes them ready for the next section in Matthew. And I say that because in the next section, you will see Jesus do more teaching on several different topics, much of it directed at the 12. There is very much a stronger focus on the disciples, even more so than what you see in the fourth section, coming up in this fifth section. You really see him pour a little bit more into these men. At the beginning of the fourth section, he adopts them, as his family basically, and he teaches them and shows them a lot. Well, all of that just continues to increase as we go into the fifth section. And that's what you can expect when we get there. The disciples are ready for the next phase of Jesus' ministry by the end of the fourth section. Which takes me back to my point about the disciples. The disciples of Christ, though weak in faith, slowly grow to understand more and thus slowly grow in faith. They are not great men. Not by any long shot at this stage in their lives can they be considered great men. They are not even men of great faith. So they fail even at this primary virtue of a believer. You know, even being believers, they believe very little. But they are still men of faith. They are still believers, in spite of their little faith. Of all the multitudes that were following Jesus to see the signs, these are the men who believed the signs. These are the men who looked past the actual miracles being done and saw something more. To them, the miracles were more than just a convenient way to be healed. To them, Jesus was more than just a prophet doing divine things. They did not at the beginning understand Jesus well enough to know what he was, but they believed in him enough to leave everything else and figure it out. They believed him enough to do that, which was more than I could say for anyone else in that time and place. And in reward for their little faith, Jesus took them the rest of the way. He taught them more. He showed them greater signs than what others saw. And by the end of it, they understood more and believed more. And that is part of Matthew's message for Israel in this 4th section. His question is, practically, are you not at least willing to see who this Jesus is? Can you not muster just a smidgen of faith to listen to this gospel and ask, is it true? Are you willing to humor Jesus, give him the benefit of a doubt, believe at least that much, and dedicate yourself to determining if he is the Christ, the Son of the living God? The example of the disciples shows that if any person is willing to go that far, Jesus will take them the rest of the way. He will take them further up that spiral of faith and understanding. So we see in this 4th section that the disciples of Christ, though weak in faith, slowly grow to understand more and thus slowly grow in faith. But now we need to go to the other idea in this 4th section. On the one hand, the disciples believe the signs, but the opposition becomes more stubborn. And here is what I have to say about them, the enemies of Christ. The enemies of Christ grow only in their stubborn refusal of convicting truth and convincing signs. That is the way I've come to summarize their half of the spectrum. They grow only in their stubborn refusal of convicting truth and convincing signs. Now, this stubbornness does not look the same in every case. We have seen several different kinds of examples of this. Matthew actually gives you 6 examples, if you want to keep calling them that. 6 pictures of this stubborn refusal in his 4th section. I want to go through each one briefly, just so you can see the different kinds of doubt and the different kinds of foolishness that result from that doubt. First, the opposition takes the form of family presumption. And I've used that phrase to very much, I don't know if it's proper for me to do so, but heap some scorn here on the way Jesus' family treats him at the beginning of this 4th section. Remember that scene where the family of Jesus shows up in the middle of everything while Jesus is trying to teach? Remember that scene there? Matthew 12, verse 46. While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside asking to speak to him. Now, again, we come to this story, we often think of that kind of cold response Jesus gives to his family and says, well, who's my family? These people are my family. We think of just how cold he is. But I say it's the other way around. The story is not about the coldness of Jesus toward his family, it's about the coldness of his family toward him. Let's ask you a question here. Would you think it odd if my family showed up right now, they walk through the door while I'm speaking, right now, and they demand that I go outside and speak to them right now? Would you find that odd? Well, of course it'd be odd. It'd be odd because it's horrendously rude. You don't interrupt a person like that, let alone someone you care about. You let them finish what they're doing, and then you talk to them. That's how it's supposed to be done. It would be rude to do otherwise. The thing is, that's how the family of Jesus treats him. His family treats him as though he's not really doing anything important. They just say, son, can you stop preaching those sermons and come out here and give your mom a hug? It's like, that's the way they treat him. They treat him with just absolute presumption, the familiarity that only a family can really provide. The attitude shows you something here, that they have no idea who or what Jesus is. They don't have an idea in the slightest of the significance of who Jesus is. They just don't get it. If they got it even in a little bit, they would not have treated him in such a low way. They're not even going to extend to him the common courtesy that you would give to any man speaking publicly, any man who's regarded as a teacher. They're not even going to give him that respect. To them, Jesus is still just mama's boy and big brother. That's it. And that's the way they treat him. You know, hey, stop what you're doing, come out here and do this other thing. That's the way they view him. And yet the signs he does and the words of his mouth prove him to be so much more. I mean, so much more. I mean, do your family members go out, healing the blind? I mean, do they get whole crowds following them? No. I mean, Jesus is not an ordinary sibling. He's not an ordinary child, not by any stretch of the imagination. But they just don't treat him that way. The presumption of Jesus' family is just one way that Matthew portrays this stubborn refusal of convicting truth and convincing signs. And his first example is from his own family, which is all the more amazing. Secondly, the opposition takes the form of pathetic, predictable, pitiful reasoning, which are words that I chose very carefully back in the day when I taught on this passage of Jesus going home to Nazareth, which is Matthew 13, 53 through 58, which I'll go ahead and read here. And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there. And coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom? And where did he get these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? Are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things?" And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown and in his own household." And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Now when I spoke on this, I called the reasoning of Nazareth pathetic because it is based on nothing more than the observation that Jesus' family lived there. They're going to take offense at him and treat him lightly simply because they can point to the house where he grew up. That's it. That is their reasoning, which is definitely pathetic because it proves nothing. That is not an argument. The Messiah has to come from somewhere, so why not there? I mean, why not your town? Why does he have to come from somewhere else? But on that basis, they take offense at him, and that's really the extent of their reasoning. It is also, however, a predictable bit of pathetic reasoning because, as Jesus said, that's just how people treat familiar people. Familiarity breeds contempt, and so the prophet has no honor in his own hometown. The reasoning had nothing profound about it. It wasn't some great stroke of insight that these people of Nazareth had. It was just common, human, shallow reasoning. It was just absolutely predictable of them, just the way people usually think. And of course, I called it pitiful because they missed out. I mean, they could have embraced the Messiah as one of their own. I mean, it sounds like kind of a trifling thing to say, but the Messiah grew up in their town. He's one of us. They could have embraced that idea. Instead, they miss out on that. They miss out on the mighty works he would have done there if they had been believing in him. But no, they missed out. Pitiful. Now, Jesus' hometown, again, don't forget this point, they knew about his mighty works. They knew about his wisdom. They said, "Where did this man get this wisdom? Where did he get these mighty works?" They knew about them. They knew about the convicting truth, and they knew about the convincing signs. They just didn't care. Just for some reason for them, it wasn't enough. You would think it'd be enough to get their attention, but no, Jesus is still little boy Jesus to them, and they can't see him as anything else. This reception in Nazareth is another form of that stubborn refusal in the face of convicting truth and convincing signs. Now there's a third form here of this opposition to Jesus. It takes the form of a deepening sin leading to deepening stupidity. Or maybe deepening insanity might be a better term based on how you view this. Matthew's classic example of this is the example of Herod, which I'll read in full here just maybe to jog your memory of all the points I brought up when I preached on this. Matthew 14, verses 1 through 12. Now at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. And he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him, and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people, because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. I spent a good chunk of my message on that passage describing how Herod falls into deeper and deeper sin, not just in his prior choices, but in this very scene. I mean, you see this man through the years of his life he sins that leads to a greater sin, sins another sin that leads to a greater sin, sins another sin that leads to a greater sin, and that's basically the course of his life, and that's the culmination of things as you see them here. But the result of all that is also one of the dumbest ideas regarding the identity of Jesus that we have on record. And that dumb idea is that he is John the Baptist risen from the dead, which makes no sense just given the chronology of the life of John the Baptist and the life of Jesus. It's a silly thing to think. Nonetheless, that's what Herod believes. But he formed that idea based on his own guilty conscience. Herod has become kind of a ghost to him, and now in the person of Jesus, that ghost has come back in the flesh to haunt him personally. That is where Herod has been led to from his sin. He's gone from his sinfulness to that stupid idea about who Jesus is. So the opposition to Jesus at times took the form of a deepening sin, leading to that kind of deepening stupidity. These crazy ideas people have about him, really because they're just wicked people, and that's where they've been driven. Next, my fourth example, the opposition takes the form of blind devotion to legalistic tradition. So legalistic tradition, legalism, this thing we've been talking about here, we talked about some time ago. Matthew 15, verses 1 through 2, just to read the beginning of that story, says, "The Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, 'Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat.'" So again, you have Jesus filling Israel with miracles, and when these men see Jesus, they want to discuss ritual hand washing. That's the big topic for them. Something which Scripture nowhere commanded. Nonetheless, it's a big deal to them. Then when Jesus shows them actually the hypocrisy and foolishness of their ways, because he goes on to do that, he goes on to argue with them about this thing, how do they respond to that when Jesus tries to talk some sense to them? Well, verse 12, he said, the disciples came and said to Jesus, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" They get offended. Oh, poor little guys, Jesus hurt their feelings because he pointed out to them the silliness of what they were saying, the idea that washing your hands in a certain way somehow makes you more holy in the eyes of God. Well, that's their way of viewing things, and it is silly, and Jesus talked to them about it, but nonetheless, their response to that is offense. So here you have a people who very much, you have this convicting truth presented to them, really no reason to deny what Jesus says, and nonetheless, they're offended at it, and they just kind of go on in greater stubbornness. So much so that they can't be cured. Jesus says in verse 14, "Let them alone, they're blind leaders of the blind. Both going to fall into a pit. Leave them alone, don't bother. I tried, it's pointless." Incurable spiritual blindness was the way I summarized that for you back in the day. Incurable. There's a fifth form of the way this stubborn refusal, the form it takes. And that is, it takes the form of arguing and testing, which you see in chapter 16, verse 1. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. Now, I've marveled over this many times, so I'll just say this one more time. These men have the audacity to ask Jesus for a sign when he has been doing signs everywhere since the beginning of his ministry. And yet they come to him and say, "Oh, show us a sign." Here are men who will never be satisfied, ever. Open the eyes of the blind, not good enough. Cleanse the lepers, not good enough. Raise the dead, not good enough. They want more and more signs. Show us a sign from heaven this time. Show us a different kind of sign. You see here in their arguing and testing a great example of their stubborn refusal in the face of convincing signs. I mean, they've seen and heard about these miracles, but it's just never good enough for them. And I think the reason for that is probably because of the convicting truth Jesus is also preaching. They don't like that, therefore they don't like his signs, therefore they don't like him, so they're going to come and argue with him and put him to the test. That's another form that this opposition takes among the enemies of Christ. And there's one more example of this, example number 6, and that is the opposition taking the form of faint praise. That is, praise that is not high enough or not good enough. For this, we must look at that one portion of the population which is probably most complicated, but also the most instructive, and that is the crowds, the multitudes. At first, it's easy to think that everyone following Jesus is a true believer, that they really are people of faith. They certainly believe in Jesus enough to come asking for healing. You know, when they have a sick relative or some problem with themselves, oh sure, they'll go out there and follow Jesus. And they seem to like to hear him preach on most occasions. They sit and listen to him as he's talking. But none of that is enough. It's just not far enough. You see, if Jesus is not honored as the Christ, then he is not honored at all. If you honor a king the way that you might honor a good math teacher, you have not honored that king, because that's not the way you honor a king. In the same way, honoring Jesus this much when he should be honored this much is not enough and does not actually honor him. And this is where the crowds have failed. What have I said in that verse in chapter 16? You know, who do others say the Son of Man is? Oh, some say he's John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. Always one of the prophets come back from the dead. You know, that's not enough. That's not good enough. They heard the teaching of Jesus, but they would not take it to its real conclusion. They saw the signs of Jesus, but would not heed their true meaning. They could not get past the prophet idea to get to the Messiah idea, even though he was laying those things before them in some way. Now, do not think in all of this, this is an important correction, that the crowds occupy some kind of middle ground. It's not as though the disciples are here with faith and the Pharisees are over here with unbelief and the crowds are somewhere in the middle. No, the crowds are very much part of the problem over here. It's just a different form of the same problem. Don't forget how this ends, because this way they have of viewing Jesus does not end in neutrality, it ends in utter hostility. Chapter 27, later in Matthew, verse 15. It says, Jesus has been arrested, and Pilate's there, and all this stuff is happening. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. So here you have these multitudes. Pilate's going to ask them a question here. And they had a notorious prisoner named Barabbas. And when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ?" So here'd be a great opportunity for them to embrace Jesus as the Christ. You know, do you want Barabbas, the robber, or Jesus who is called the Christ? For he knew that it was out of envy that they, that is the Sanhedrin, had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus who is called the Christ?" It's like he keeps dropping that phrase in there. What do you want me to do with this man that some are saying is your Messiah? And they said, let him be crucified. It's like, you can't just, lesser punishment. I mean, you want to crucify the guy? And Pilate says, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, let him be crucified. I mean, these people, they're not a middle position. They're not neutral. This is a form of hostility to Jesus to say he's just a prophet. And if that's your idea of Jesus, you will end up over here with all these other people manipulating for things behind the scenes to get Jesus murdered. It's just another form of opposition. It's the opposition of faint praise, leading to cries for blood. So those are Matthew's 6 forms of opposition, all very different. Now, what is the common bond? I mean, what do all these people have in common? Well, zero faith. The disciples were men of little faith, but Jesus took that little faith and added some knowledge to it, and he grew it into more faith. That's what happened to the disciples. But everyone else is faithless. Jesus' family, Nazareth, Herod, the scribes, the Pharisees and Sadducees, the crowds, not a shred of true faith at all. And to him who has not, even what he seems to have will be taken away, just like Jesus said in chapter 13. That's what you get when you have zero faith. You see, every unbeliever says the same thing. Oh, let God come down. Let God do something. And then we will believe in him after God has proven himself. But the fact is, God did come down. And God did do many things through Jesus. And they still did not believe when they saw those things. That is the nature of unbelief. If you don't have any faith, nothing else matters. Nothing else breaks through. You can have God in the flesh walking around healing every single sick person in your midst, and you just won't care. You're not going to get anywhere with it because of your zero faith. And you got to realize that God does not show himself to people who scorn faith in that way. God shows himself to the faithful. He shows himself to those who have the attitude of a disciple. And if that's not you, then you are left with less than what you had before, which was nothing. And that is the pathway you follow. And that, I think, is how Matthew uses the ideas of this 4th section. As I mentioned earlier, Matthew provides the disciples as an example of what you get if you'll just give Jesus a chance. But Matthew gives some teeth to that idea by giving you the other side. If you won't give Jesus a chance, if your faith is so low that it's non-existent, what do you get in that case? Well, you might become a presuming jerk like the family of Jesus. You might become a small-minded and cliché sort of person like the people at Nazareth. You might be driven half crazy by sin like Herod was. You might cling to senseless legalism like the scribes did. You could spend the rest of your life testing God just because nothing he says or does is ever good enough for you. Or you can flatter yourself that you're a true believer just to find out later that you're on the road to faithlessness, just like the crowds. One way or another, the enemies of Christ can only grow in their stubborn refusal of convicting truth and convincing signs. And if all of that displeases you, you can try faith. You can get off that path. You can heed the warning here that Matthew has given you by implication, and you can get off that road and actually give Jesus a chance and follow him like a disciple and prove him. See if he takes that little faith that you've been able to muster there and develop it into something that understands him greater and grows into greater faith. We have a testimony from Matthew in his own treatment of the disciples that Jesus can do that. And that, I think, is why Matthew has spent all this time showing you how the disciples believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. He lays out both roads, one riding the spiral of faith and understanding upward, and the other riding it downward. One of them is an encouragement, the other one's a warning. Which is the extent of what I really wanted to say here today. Just kind of hit all that briefly, then we'll close this down. First, I surveyed the 4th section, my first point. I surveyed the 4th section of Matthew very quickly from the standpoint of Matthew's outline. And of course, the phase of this gospel is dedicated to those two main ideas about Jesus having disciples who believed the signs while the opposition became more stubborn. Secondly, I examined the 4th section with regard to the disciples. And the disciples of Christ, though weak in faith, slowly grow to understand more, and thus slowly grow in faith. And then finally, I examined the fourth section with regard to the enemies of Christ. The enemies of Christ grow only in their stubborn refusal in the face of convicting truth and convincing signs. And I was again hoping to push this one final idea of the fourth section, which faith leads to understanding, which leads into greater faith, while the opposite is also true, that unbelief leads to less understanding, which leads to even less faith. So it's definitely a spiral going both ways, and you have to decide which way you're going to ride that spiral, the spiral of faith and understanding. And with that, the fourth section of Matthew is complete, and we're going to take a break from Matthew for a while, and I will start that series on the great Messianic Psalms, which may be the 5 or 6 great Messianic Psalms. I'm not too sure yet, but we will start that next time I teach. So we'll have a break from Matthew before we move on to his fifth section. Are there any questions on this message or on really, I guess, anything in the fourth section is fair game, technically at this point? Any questions or comments on these things?